Okay. So hi, my name is Katie Sweetman, and this is my webinar titled Facing Saturn, Learn to Master Your Life. And as I was saying a few moments ago when we were having a little kind of quick introduction before we officially started, Saturn is one of my favorite planets, but doesn't mean that it's a warm and cuddly planet. Let me just check. There's a question in the chat. Yes, hello everybody. I'm so excited to be able to join you tonight and hopefully present Saturn in a way that might be a little new or maybe not so new if you've been reading my work or even the work of other astrologers. So let's, and I subtitled it Learn to Master Your Life because I believe, I don't think this is entirely an original thought, but I do believe that Saturn gives us a very clear framework about how to master our life, meaning we all have some lesson that we're learning. It might be money, it might be relationships. I kind of subscribe to the philosophy that Earth is a classroom, this life is a classroom, and there's a structure to it. And when you know that structure and you learn to work with that structure, and maybe even pushing yourself to do so, you're going to have a much different relationship with Saturn than you otherwise. So we'll explain a little bit about that more as we go along. So if this is the first time you're joining me for a webinar, thank you so much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be able to share my passion with you all, which is astrology. I am located here in New York City. I'm a consulting astrologer. I'm also a psychic medium. And I created Empowering Astrology in 2010 because at the time it felt like there was, I don't know, a voice that was missing. The astrology that I wanted to read, that I wanted to interface with. So I just started to create my own work, and here we are, 8 years later, pretty much 9 years later, and I get to connect with you all across the world, which is really I'm honored, definitely. So just a quick introduction about Saturn. Shari in Boston asks, would I consider Saturn your soul's purpose? Now, this actually starts to touch into, soul's purpose. I don't think it's just one thing. I think that it's a combination. I think Saturn just helps to manifest it because Saturn is such a real, planet. When we get into soul's purpose, I look more at the nodes, but I also have to take in the entirety of the chart. I look at the nodes. I look at the ruler of the nodes. Saturn kind of gives you the structure of what you're trying to learn in this lifetime. It kind of weaves a story in addition to the nodes in Saturn and maybe planets in the 12th house, maybe interception. So I'm from a, let's say, a soul perspective, looking at a lot of different points. But that's a good question. Thank you, Shari. So I'm kind of a Saturn fangirl. I think because Saturn does get this bad reputation in astrology, and for good reason. It's the planet of endings and bones and teeth and hard work and loss. And why would I be a fan of that? Well, when I started to learn astrology way back in the olden days before the internet, I got my hands on my astrology chart for the first time, and this was way back in the day. And I saw my chart, and it had all these Saturn squares to it. So you can imagine being an impressionable teenager, and you look up to see what Saturn is, and it's something that you don't want to have in your chart. So I was pretty bummed out. I've Mars squares Saturn. I've got Mercury squares Saturn. And you read these explanations, and it talks about delays. It talks about struggle and strife. And I just, as a 14, 15-year-old, you're like, what am I going to do with this? So I think one of the ways I look at astrology is to not use astrology or your birth chart as a way to almost like come on, cement your fate. That there, that you're trying to learn something. It's, if I had at age, a teenager given up, we would not be having this conversation today. So, which brings me to when I had to face Saturn. So fast forward, I'm in my late 20s, and I'm coming up to something called the Saturn return, which is something that we will talk about more in depth later in this webinar. And the Saturn return is a time when Saturn literally returns to where it was in the sky when you were born. It happens at age 28, 29. And my life was falling apart, and I was trying to figure out, like, why is now so hard? And long story short, somebody mentioned the Saturn return. I looked it up and I was like, whoa. Suddenly everything made sense. And through a bit of a process, this wasn't just overnight, I started to realize that the things that I was experiencing, let's say the emotions that I was having, the process that I was undergoing, there was a plan to it. At the time, I actually was incredibly broke. I had Saturn going through my 8th house. And I answered an ad in Craigslist for 2 astrologers here in New York City called the Saturn Sisters that needed a IT person. I have a background in IT. And it was through that process of learning and like working with them and learning about Saturn that I kind of became initiated into the cult of Saturn, if you can say that. But I had to really go through a lot of personal struggle and strife at my Saturn return. And even though it kicked my butt, it was that process that made me into an astrologer. It brought me to my purpose as an astrologer. Had I not gone through that, let's say, dark night of the soul, had I not struggled, had I not questioned, maybe, and had I not reached towards astrology to give me the answers I was looking for, we wouldn't be having this conversation. My life would be very different. So in hindsight, I see exactly what Saturn was trying to do. And I have some deep respect for that, but that respect didn't come overnight. So it's that level of respect that I hope tonight to be able to transmit and to convey to you all, so that you too can look at Saturn differently and step up to the lessons of mastery that it wants you to incarnate, for lack of a better word, and to learn. So Saturn teaches us something very simple. If you adhere to the structure of your lesson plan, so to speak, life's going to be very different. I still believe, I don't think this is like a magical panacea that your life is suddenly going to become kittens and puppies if you do everything that Saturn says. But I've noticed, and this is my personal experience, and I think I've seen this also in friends and clients, is that when we really answer and step up to what Saturn's asking of us, it's like we kind of get a little bit of a pat on the back, and we have a relationship, a renewed relationship, or a transformed relationship with this idea of commitment and responsibility. There was a time in my life where I was going to have what was called Saturn transit my sun in Scorpio. And I'm like, oh man, like I can't go through another Saturn transit. My return nearly killed me. But I put the work in and I was very diligent. And I felt like when Saturn finally came to my sun, it was more of the pat on the back. It was like, okay, you now get the keys to the car, so to speak. You've earned the responsibility. So I think that when we look at our chart, when we know where our Saturn is, and we know what house it's in, that gives us a very simple, let's say, framework and lesson plan that we're working with. So just quick agenda for tonight for those who are listening in the replay or have the slides. This is the structure that we're going with. So let us begin. And again, if you guys have any questions as we continue, just please pop them in the chat. That's what I'm here for. So, facing Saturn, what does it mean to face Saturn? Well, we can face Saturn like this. This is a picture of Saturn from the Cassini space probe. This was a space probe that was launched in 1997. I believe it got into Saturn around 2003, 2004, if I'm remembering correctly. And I think it's pretty amazing. This is just me being a nerd that we can take this close of a photo of a planet like Saturn. But I think it's good to witness the gods, so to speak, and know who you're working with. And this is Saturn. So I named this Facing Saturn because there are times when we have to face Saturn in our life. The Saturn return is an example. There are also different ages that are, like, let's say, Saturn ages, and I'll also talk about them further in the webinar. But there are times throughout the year when we also have to face Saturn. Saturn kind of does the mini check-in with us. So, tomorrow, as I record this, Saturn's about to turn direct in Capricorn. We're having a big check-in with Saturn. So this means that we're feeling Saturn's energy, the need to look at our life more critically, or make serious choices, or kind of clean things up sometimes, take big steps. So every time Saturn turns direction, that happens twice a year, maybe, or when when we're in Capricorn season, for instance, is a time when we're in a Saturn-ruled sign. So there are certain months of the year that are more, when the sun's in Capricorn, when the sun is in Aquarius. Those are times when we have to check in with Saturn. And Saturn's like, hey, are you doing your work? Remember, you came into this life with a plan, and I'm going to help you execute that plan. So you can either fight it or you can either step up to it. So facing Saturn also means that we have to face ourselves. We have to get very sober. There's the sobriety to Saturn. It's a planet that just cuts through illusions, artifice, BS, whatever words you want to use, and it forces us to get real. So whether it's tomorrow or this week, because Saturn is turning direct, or the Saturn return, or another time, there are times when we have to get real. We have to face ourselves. We have to face our choices, and we have to face what we've built. Because Saturn is, this is a little bit of a side note, Saturn's like Pluto in the sense that it works on the level of reality that's about cause and effect. It's called causal reality. I mean, if I choose something, if I say something, if I do something, there's an effect to it. So Saturn is governing that force. And it's like, okay, you chose left. Okay, this is what happens when you go that direction, or vice versa. But Saturn's also the planet of structure. And it's important that we are always trying to build something with Saturn. So as I mentioned already, there are specific ages when we have to face Saturn, Saturn return. There's even, which I'll talk about later, there are certain ages, 14, age 7, age 21, age 36, when we're having a check-in with Saturn. Saturn is a slow-moving planet. It takes 29 years to go around the sun. So Saturn, in astrology, it's speaking to a much bigger story. It's like a slower arc of time. The thing about astrology is it depends on the person, the astrologer communicating the astrology, but we can get very much in the day-to-day details and lose picture of the bigger story. So I think that this webinar or Saturn turning direct tomorrow is a good time to check in with the bigger story. Where are we going? What are we working on? And, I think that we're always going to go back to the bigger lesson in our life. That's like this thread that we always go back to. So just some quick, what's Saturn? For the people that are maybe a little bit newer to astrology. If you've been on one of my webinars, I love me some astronomy. So let's just have some quick Saturn facts. Saturn is the sixth planet from the sun. And as I was mentioning earlier, Saturn takes 29 and a half years to go around the sun. That's a long time, to kind of give you a little bit of scale. Of course, it takes Earth 1 year to go around the sun, takes Mercury 88 days to go around the sun, but 29 years is a long time. If we were looking at other planets, let's say Uranus is 84 years, Pluto is 246 or 8, if I remember correctly. So Saturn does take time, but not as long. Somebody's asking a question about their chart. Let's ask me that question later. We're going to get to that part later. What Saturn in the 10th house, for instance, means. I think it's also important to take note that Saturn is the last. It's the last planet that's visible to the naked eye. You need a telescope to see anything beyond Saturn. In fact, you need a telescope to see Saturn's rings. We didn't know that Saturn had rings until the 17th century, when Galileo first saw the rings of Saturn. But, because Saturn represents the last planet that you can see, there's a sense of Saturn is the end, its limitations, its boundaries, it's the physical world, it's what you can see. Everything beyond Saturn you can't see. So it represents something that is not quite about reality. It's about something more. Saturn isn't the only planet with rings. Actually, Neptune, Jupiter, Uranus, all the gas giants have rings. And Saturn has 62 moons. That's a lot of moons. Interesting enough, I don't know, I like this kind of facts. Saturn has a hexagon-shaped vortex at its north pole, which, I don't know, I think that's pretty nifty. This is just something I came across when I was researching Saturn. There's a Dutch astronomer, Christian Huygens, if I'm saying his name right, and he was the first person to really, not to see the rings, but I think kind of be able to see that the rings were a disk that was around the planet. So this is a book that he did in 1659. So we have to also understand that Saturn has mythology associated with it, and that sometimes that mythology gets into the archetypes in astrology. All the planets, except for the modern ones, like the really modern ones, are all derived from Roman gods. So Saturn is the name of the Roman god of wealth and agriculture, and its Greek equivalent was Kronos. And when the symbol for Saturn, when I'll show it to you in a moment, it looks like a scythe, looks like a sickle, which is used in agriculture to cut, to harvest wheat. Yeah, that's the symbol for Saturn. So if you're somewhat new to astrology, this is the symbol that you're looking for in the chart to be able to find your Saturn. In astrology, Saturn is the planet of structure and boundaries. Remember, I said that Saturn is the last planet that you can see. So it represents the end. It represents something, you're kind of running up against. Up until, let's say, 1780, 81, you didn't know that there were any planets after Saturn. So classical astrology ends at Saturn. And so it's a planet also of delays and loss. And sometimes when we're under a lot of Saturn influence in the astrology, things take time. They do not happen overnight. And remember that Saturn takes 29 years. So sometimes it takes a decade. Sometimes it takes 20 years for something to really come to fruition. And I think that that's why Saturn has this reputation as a malefic, because it slows things down. It's not about sometimes what we want. It's about something else. It's about cause and effect. It's about karma. Saturn, it also, I mean, I've said this already, it's teaching us to grow and mature. So this is why it's a process that takes time. Bones, it takes a long time for, going from a baby to a fully grown adult. It takes time for the bones to grow and for you to mature into a fully formed human being. Um, Saturn rules Capricorn and Aquarius. Just as a side note, I use what's called traditional rulers. So Saturn has two signs. I know that some of you are preferential to Uranus as the modern ruler of Aquarius, but that's kind of a separate conversation for another time. But I just wanted to put that in there. A new look at Saturn. It's important to note that definitely the viewpoint that I'm giving you all on Saturn is a very modern viewpoint on Saturn. If there are definitely astrologers out there, even in this day and age, who do more traditional or classical astrology, who have a very different presentation on Saturn. But I'm coming from kind of let's say the branch of astrology that's spiritual or psychologically or humanistically driven. In 1976, Liz Green wrote a book called Saturn, A New Look at an Old Devil. And it was a really influential book because it introduced Saturn as this, let's say, the presentation that I'm doing here, that it's something that you're working with, that you're something that you're learning from. Saturn is, in a way, an archetype of the devil. That's why she says it's a new look at an old devil. And so she was talking, because she has this background in Jungian psychology and development, and so she was showing how Saturn really affects how you grow and how you mature as an adult, and specifically the lessons that you learn. And when I read this during my Saturn return, it gave me some sense of hope, in the sense that my life wasn't just randomly falling apart. So, just side note, I have Saturn in the 9th house. So I read Saturn in the 9th house, I read Saturn in Virgo, and it gave me some clarity. So you may too want to read this, just putting that out there, and wanted to give Liz Green credit where credit is due. So what she did is that she reframed Saturn. That's what we're doing here. We're reframing Saturn. Saturn is still seen as a malefic force in a lot of astrology, and perhaps for very good reason. But I don't believe that Saturn is capricious, which is to say that these things just kind of happen to us at random. We're being punished, so to speak. That when we take a step back and when we look at our chart and we can see the curriculum and the lessons that Saturn is teaching us, that we can see what Saturn's doing. So we have those certain lessons that we came here to master, depending on where Saturn was in your chart. And so those are lessons that you're going to keep returning to over and over again until, over time, you're going to have a very different relationship with your Saturn lessons than you did when you were much younger. Saturn also rules over time. It's, Capricorn, both Capricorn and Aquarius are what are called the signs of matter and manifestation. And so I always say to people, at the end of the day, we're under Saturn's rules, meaning we're in a physical body, we are in a physical world, and there are certain laws that go with that. Yes, we do have other planets that we're working with. Let's say the outer planets that kind of opens up to a different dimensionality of life, and let's say even spiritual life. But at the end of the day, we have to play by Saturn's rules. So things take time with Saturn. I have this friend, he was going through his Saturn return. I guess you could still say he is going through his Saturn return, because I subscribe to the belief that as long as Saturn is still in the sign that your Saturn is in, you're still in the return. You're not in the exact return, but you're still in the return. We'll talk about that when we talk about the Saturn return more. And he was talking about there was like all this stuff that he wanted to do, and it was kind of cocky, and he said, okay, next year it's going to be this. I'm going to have this business, I'm going to have this money, I'm going to have, check, check, check. And I looked at him and I'm like, you're going through your Saturn return. Things take time. And, I had to learn this myself. During my Saturn return, I came to astrology in a much deeper way. And it was like, oh, I want to be an astrologer. But my Saturn return was 11 years ago. I'm dating myself. So things take time to grow and to manifest and to come to fruition. And that's a little bit of a hard maybe point to make, because I know we live in a world where we want it now, but we have to respect time, and that things take time. And that ultimately will age, will grow older, that life has limits. Maybe I'm just being a Scorpio here. So I always say, just play by Saturn's rules. I feel like it's a pretty simple formula. I'm not, and I think with an asterisk, I think the asterisk is that at the end, we also have to know that Saturn, there's a density to Saturn, there's a calcification to Saturn. And if we get too hard, Saturn is teeth and bones, Saturn is structure, too hard, I think that's when we start to lose a little bit of the flexibility and the magic of life. And that's when we hit our early 40s and we have something called the Uranus opposition at age 41, 42, 43. That shakes the old structures so that we don't get too complacent, we don't get too hard. So that's what I'm saying, play by Saturn's rules, know that there's cause and effect, know that there are things that you have to learn this lifetime, and that your relationship with those lessons will grow and mature, but don't get so hard that you kind of, become a robot in your own life. So Saturn time, and I talked about this a little bit already, but we'll go into it a little more. Every planet has a rhythm and has a cycle. So as I was saying earlier, Mercury, for instance, has a cycle of 88 days, because it takes 88 days to go around the sun, and it takes 88 days to go around the chart. Saturn takes 29 years to go around your chart. So wherever it was when you were born, it might be in a very different place now, and it might take a long time to get back to where it was when you were born, depending on how old you are right now. So Saturn, if it's 29 years, 29 and a half, really, to go around the sun, we can divide that into these 7-year quarters, and that's actually an important number. By the way, we see 7 repeated a lot in manifestation. Those 7 classical planets, those 7 days of the week, those 7 chakras. Anyway, I digress. So Saturn, there's actually a correlation between childhood development and young adult development and those quarters of Saturn. So we're born age 7, so we're coming up to what's called the first Saturn square, the first quarter of a Saturn cycle. And age 7 in child development is when the child is starting to separate from the family. There's a sense of individualization that hasn't been there before. Up until that point, the child is still, attached to the parent, but age 7 is when they start to show that they're more of a independent person. Age 14 is what's called the Saturn opposition. The Saturn opposition is that teenager angst. You're kind of you're pushing against boundaries, you're pushing against authority, and you're trying to figure out what are the limits of your young life at that time. Age 21 is the what's called the closing Saturn square, the last quarter before the Saturn return. And so age 21, you're, and at least within here in the United States and many other countries, there's a sense of now you're a young adult, you're an adult, but you're going out on your own. Maybe you've graduated college. There's a sense it's much different in terms of maturity than previous. And then you get 7 years later to the Saturn return, age 28, 29. I say 28 because I've seen it over and over and over again. It's starting. I'll hear friends, I'll hear clients, they start to use the language. They're starting to say things like, what am I going to do with my life? Where am I going? They're starting to question things. And it's like, there's a lot of internal reflection. There's comments about things being hard. There's a need to, let's say, make commitments and to figure out your life. So that's why I throw in 28, because it's already starting, but the exact Saturn return is during the 29th year. So if 29 is what's called the first Saturn return, if you do live long enough, you'll have the second Saturn return at age 58 and the next one at 87. So you have to live a very long time. But the first one is very monumental. And after the Saturn return, or the first Saturn return, things are tested. You have these what are called these 7-year check-ins with life and the things that you committed to during your Saturn return. And so it's just kind of take note that things kind of get tested every 7 years. And maybe some of you have heard of the 7-year itch. It's not just a movie, it's actually a psychological concept. The researchers found that I think it's the average duration of a marriage before divorce is 7 years. So there's something about that 7 years where a couple decides whether or not this is going to work. And and I'm saying this as a perspective as an astrologer, when I look at a chart and I'm working with a client, that 7-year mark, like Saturn tests things. Saturn's like, is it going to last? Is this going to take you all the way to the Saturn return? I've even heard, clients that have gotten divorced when the marriage got to the Saturn return, but that's a side note. But yes, things get tested every 7 years. And the big test is the Saturn return. So whether it's the first Saturn return or the second Saturn return, I think that the first one is a bit more monumental than the second one, which we'll go in. And as I mentioned before, we do have times where we have those smaller tests. It could be the sun's going through Capricorn and we have a Capricorn new moon, or it could be Saturn's in Capricorn right now, or it could be that Saturn is turning direct, like it is tomorrow. So also something to keep in mind, Saturn changes, Saturn is still moving around the sun, it's still moving around the zodiac. And every 3 years it goes into a new sign. So I like to use this analogy that the planets, as they're moving right now, they're like hands on the clock. So, Saturn, think of Saturn as a hand on the clock, as a hand on the clock of your life, on your birth chart. And every 3 years, it goes into a new sign. And when that happens, we have to collectively start working on the lessons of that new sign that Saturn has entered in. And then 3 years after that, we'll start working on another sign. And then on a personal level, depending on where Saturn is in the chart, by what we say in astrology called by transit, you're going to start working on that part of your chart intently. But I think that it's important to say it always threads back to where Saturn is in your chart. So even though, for instance, Saturn is in Capricorn for all of us right now, it will be in Capricorn until next year. Our experiences right now with Saturn and Capricorn thread back to where Saturn was where we're born, regardless of whether we have, Saturn and Capricorn. So good segue, the Saturn return. I know some of you who signed up for this are in your Saturn return, and whether it's more than likely you're in your first Saturn return. If you are, you could be in your second Saturn return. If you're listening, you would be about age 58, if that's the case. But if you are 28, 29, you are in the Saturn return. You could even say age 30 as well. So Saturn, it marks time, it marks milestones, it marks these kind of defining moments of our life. And the Saturn return, when we go back and look at it, should we have already been through it, we see that age marked us in some way, marked our life in some way. For me, it was coming to astrology, finding my purpose. It took, a lot of struggle and strife to be at peace with that. But had I not gone through those experiences, I would not be here today. We would not be having this conversation. So maybe, if you've already gone through your Saturn return, think back. What was age 28 and 29 like for you? What commitments did you make? What choices did you make? What career, maybe you made a career change, maybe you got married, maybe you started a family. Saturn works on that, like that bigger level. It's not everyday life. It's those things that when we, God forbid, die and our life flashes before us, these are like the big things that stand out. And maybe this sounds morbid, but it's like your Saturn is like the stuff that goes in your obituary. It's like the stuff that you are remembered for over time. It's not the little day-to-day stuff. The thing about the Saturn return, and maybe this is a little bit of a statement, is that the karmic bill is due. Everybody has a different Saturn return experience. I do think the 20s are meant to be a time of exploration and play and trying out new things, but there is a sense of when you get to the Saturn return, you're having to own up for everything that you've been doing up until that point. There's a really talented astrologer here in New York City. Nobody really knows about her because she doesn't do a lot of stuff that's out in the world. She kind of does conferences and more small stuff, but she's a really great astrologer. Her name is Eileen McCabe. And she once said, and this really stuck with me, that it's at the Saturn return that you commit to your life. You commit to your karma, you commit to your path. And so maybe that kind of gives you another layer of understanding what this process is. You're okay, I'm going to do this. Maybe that's why the 27 Club, this idea that people tend to, commit suicide or leave life at 27, maybe they're just all right, I don't want to deal with this lesson or this path. So sometimes, and I will say that the Saturn return is not always bad. And so the Saturn return might be a time when you're making some big changes, some major personal milestones. Again, maybe there's a marriage, maybe you've moved across country, maybe you've bought a house, and you look back and you're that wasn't so bad. I mean, fantastic. Maybe you have a relationship with authority or with commitment and work that's different from other people. I don't know, but sometimes the Saturn return is not this kind of big bad thing that it often gets compared to, but sometimes it is that crossroads moment in your life. It's personal reckoning. You have to restructure things. I sometimes think of Saturn return as the chiropractor, getting things back into alignment. It's a little bit of a technical astrology comment, but Saturn is exalted in the sign of Libra. So I think ultimately Saturn wants balance. It wants fairness. And if something's not balanced, something's not fair, you get to the Saturn return and you have to bring things back into harmony and into balance. So that's why I think sometimes it's very common that, let's say, people leave relationships, they change careers, they make like a little bit of a diversion during the Saturn return, but maybe it's because they're getting closer to what they really want to do. Because let's be honest, a lot of the things that we're doing in our 20s is the stuff that we think we're supposed to be doing. It's the stuff that our parents tell us to do. It's, be a lawyer because we're all lawyers, not because you want to be a lawyer. So maybe you're coming to your real work at the Saturn return. I'm just going to check a comment from Joe, a question. Joe asked, what if you commit to a life choice at your Saturn return that isn't positive? Does that lock you into that choice? I don't know if it kind of fully locks you into that choice. I think that you do have those check-ins with Saturn. Age 36 is what's called the opening Saturn square after the Saturn return. And Saturn's like, hey, is this what you really want? But the Saturn return is a foundation. And if you're making choices that are creating a little bit of a shaky foundation at the Saturn return, that's what you're building on. So there might be points, age 36, age 43, if I remember correctly, it'll have it on one of the slides, where you have to adjust, you have to make changes. And I'm showing you life very much from the perspective of Saturn. Do know that there are other planets that are kind of trying to awaken us and try to show us that maybe the choices that we made aren't the best. So hopefully that answers your question, Joe. So when I talk about the Saturn return, it feels like the treadmill suddenly, at the gym, the treadmill just started to go up at that steep incline. It's just suddenly your muscles are burning and you're tired and everything is harder. I'll use the term with people. It's like you're under Saturn's gaze at this point. You're under Saturn's watch. It's, you're in a space where the parent or whatever the authority figure is looking at you. You can't get away with much of anything. You're under scrutiny. And so I think it's important to really honor that level of scrutiny and not try to get away with things that are not good. Trying to, let's say, outrun the law during your Saturn return maybe isn't the best bet. I personally wouldn't do it, but we still have free will. You can try it if you want to, but as your astrologer or maybe your prospective astrologer, I would not recommend it. Because during the Saturn time, we're really dealing with the energy of consequence. And again, the Saturn return doesn't have to be this like heavy, bad, or tough thing. Everybody's going to be differently. But it is a time when we have to really think seriously about life. Complete personal, like aside, when I was learning about the Saturn return and about astrology, they would often say that men had different Saturn returns than women, which I take personal umbrage with. We live in a world where women can also have careers. So you're gonna a man and a woman, you're going through the same, let's say, thematic or archetypical experience. You're growing up, you're growing older, you're making choices, and everybody's going to live that differently. So I once said that, like, because it's a man, he's having issues with his father, and sometimes there are like quote unquote father issues during the Saturn return, because just like on a child development level, it's generally the father that we learn that kind of that energy of authority. But I get a little personally, I don't like to try to be so gender stereotype, because things are just way different than they were in some of these old astrology books. So as I was saying before, we have to put things back in balance during our Saturn return, and it has to be rectified. And I think that we can't. It's like if we get to the Saturn return and the car is a mess, it needs a new engine or it needs some work. We can't keep driving the car. That's just consequence. Um, and I think I said this already, but it's worth thinking back when you have a moment. What did you commit to during your Saturn return? What did you, was it a career? Was it a relationship? Was it a life direction? If you're going through your Saturn return right now, if you are age 28, 29, what sort of questions or directions or commitments are coming your way? If you are age 58 in the second Saturn return, you may be reevaluating the choices that you've made the previous 29 years. And then, or maybe you're totally okay with the choices that you've made. Yeah, so ages 36, 43, and 50. So this with the 36 is what's called the opening Saturn square after the Saturn return. So you've gone through the Saturn return, and now Saturn is getting to that 7-year, check-in, and it's saying, okay, whatever you've been building, whatever you've been committing to, how's it going? And then you either say, oh, wow, this is not working, and you make some changes, or you just keep plugging on. It's, the type of astrology that I do is coming from this kind of very, easy philosophy, like be conscious with all your planets, put all your planets into light, meaning do not do your planets on autopilot. Don't do Saturn on autopilot. Don't wake up one day and realize that you haven't really been thinking and reflecting. So maybe if you're at these ages, 36 or getting close to 36 or 43 or 50, how can you sit down and reflect on how you've been working with Saturn based on where it was when you were born. Yes, the second Saturn return is age 58. And I kind of said this already, it's Saturn returns, there's no illusions in the Saturn return. You have to get very real. I've seen some people try to maintain illusions during the Saturn return. It's like it'll take time to see how it plays out. But Saturn in general is really trying to cut through the illusions that we have about ourselves and about life, and get us to kind of have our feet firmly on the ground, because at the end of the day, Saturn is about reality, and it's about this material world that we live in. So the phases of Saturn, I have this kind of pet, I don't know if it's a pet theory or just maybe it's just how I look at Saturn. It's that Saturn has these 3 faces to it, like these 3 archetypes. Saturn can be the cop, it can be the parent, or it can be the life coach. Depending on how you are interfacing with Saturn and your relationship with Saturn, or the Saturn themes of responsibility and time and maturity, depending is the kind of level of Saturn you're going to get. If we transgress the rules or the laws, like if we go rob a bank, that's a law, then there's going to be something that happens, usually, unless we're like really well skilled, and then my theory kind of falls apart. But I still think that there's a sense of like, if we haven't been accountable in our life, if we've tried to do something that's not good or against the law, or it doesn't have to be like the actual law. Maybe it's just the things that you just don't do. It's going to come out at some point. And sometimes you'll look at the astrology of people in the news when they get that slap on the wrist, or they get taken to jail, or something comes out, and they're going through a Saturn transit. I think Nixon, Watergate was Saturn going through his what's called 10th house. 10th house is your reputation, it's your career, it's the most public place in your chart, and it all came out. So I think that Saturn, like I said, the karmic bill is due at some point. Maybe this life, maybe the next life, but that's what Saturn's trying to do. So I just personally don't like to work with Saturn at the level of the cop. The other face of Saturn is Saturn as the parent. And you know, if we think about the archetype of the parent, there are two people, usually, who want the best for you and want you to have the best in life. And they want you, hopefully, to work hard to get it. They're not, they're setting healthy limits and boundaries for you. That's what a parent is supposed to do. They're supposed to tell you no. We know what happens when kids grow up and they have no sense of boundaries. They have no sense of cause and effect, or no sense of what happens when somebody tells you no. They're not the best, most productive members of the world. So we need that energy. We need Saturn as the parent. And sometimes that parent, we either respect them or fear them, something that we're really intimidated by. The other face of Saturn is that of the life coach. And I think that to get to Saturn as the life coach, we have to really work with Saturn on a conscious level. This idea that Saturn has the master plan. Let's say he has like a binder, a clipboard, whatever sort of imagery that you want to work with. And Saturn sits you down and says, like, okay, this is the plan. This is what you agreed to. Maybe this is a little bit of a psycho-spiritual look at Saturn. But this idea that there were boxes that you wanted to check off in this life. There were classes you wanted to take. There were curriculum that you wanted to learn, and that ultimately you were trying to achieve X, whatever X is for you. And so Saturn says, great, my job is to make sure that you get to the finish line, that you figure this out, that you learn your lessons. And so that's when Saturn becomes a life coach. They're trying to get us to reach those higher goals. And if you've ever worked with a personal trainer, if you ever worked with a life coach, they're going to hold you accountable. So they, hopefully they're not yelling at you, but they're like, what are you doing? You said you do this. It's this, this idea that Saturn makes us aware of time. It's like, this is due. This is why aren't you doing this? So it has our, let's say, our best intentions in mind. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that we are ultimately learning to become these three Saturns. And to be the cop, we have to be comfortable with telling people no. You can do that very kindly, and you can do that with a compassion, of course, but setting boundaries doesn't always come naturally to everybody. Telling people no doesn't always come naturally. So we have to show where other people, again, loving and compassionately, where they've kind of stepped over the mark, where they have crossed a line. That's where we learn to find our own strength, where we get to be, let's say, the cop, or be the parent to take on responsibility, and to also to teach others about responsibility, and to shape, let's say, somebody's growth. And so whether you are learning to reach for your own goals or helping others to reach for their own goals, this is how you too can become Saturn in your life. So Saturn in our chart. So Saturn is the planet of lessons. And depending on where Saturn was, where it was when you were born, talks about the plan. It talks about the lessons that you're learning. And so you're going to want to look at Saturn by sign and Saturn by house. Hopefully I messaged everybody to look up, at the very least, if you're new to astrology, Saturn by sign. If you are unsure about where Saturn is by house, you can easily look up your chart after this webinar, as you're watching the replay, and to find what house your Saturn is in. Technical point, little side note, I would look at where Saturn is by both Placidus, which is what's called the most common house system, or whole sign. I think both, that it might be different, and that might give you some different, like deeper material to work with. That's a little bit of a technical side note. So yeah, I think it's to know where your Saturn is and to know where it is by house and sign. It gives you a lot of framework to work with, and knowing that that's what your life, what Saturn keeps pushing you back towards, um, means you're kind of working with what Saturn is setting out for you. And I firmly believe that we can't escape these lessons. We're here in a physical world with a physical body, and we are under Saturn's rules. Saturn's we can't run away from these lessons. They will come to us at some point. Maybe it's the Saturn return, maybe it's another time. So because Saturn has such a long what's called transit, some of you on this call, like you might group more just based on your age and certain signs, but I will go through all of the signs so we have them. So when Saturn is in a sign, we are learning to really work through lessons around that sign. And then we apply it to the house, which we'll get to in a few moments. So, for instance, if you have Saturn in Aries, you are learning these deeper lessons around courage. Aries is a sign of bravery. It's a sign of leadership. It's a Mars-ruled sign. And Mars is about taking action. And so you might have times in your life where you have to stand up for yourself, where you have to say no. Just like that Mars energy, Mars is no. And ultimately it's about courage. And then of course you would take that Aries energy and then apply it to the house, which we will in a few moments. I think if you have Saturn in Taurus, ultimately you're learning about value. Taurus is so much about the physical world, physical reality, material life, material needs. But I think that really all distills down to value. What do you value? Do you value yourself? Do you value other people? Do you value your health? But I think Saturn is in Taurus. You're really learning these powerful lessons around value, even if it's something as simple as valuing your body. Because you need to take care of it. Saturn. Moving to Gemini, if you have Saturn in Gemini, I think ultimately this distills down to learning powerful lessons around ideas. Gemini to me is the sign of choice. And I think because Gemini is so much about information and learning it, that it does distill down to choice. But ultimately, you're learning about information, about ideas, the power of ideas, and also the karma of ideas. Because Saturn in a sign is that we're learning the karma of that sign. We're learning, let's say, when we've broken the rules, what does that mean for that sign? So with Gemini, for instance, what happens when we use our voice maybe in a way that isn't good? Maybe it hurts other people. But I think that wherever Saturn is by sign, you're very hyper aware of the seriousness and the gravity of that sign. You can't take that sign for granted. Saturn in Cancer. I think this ultimately boils down to connection. Cancer, ruled by the moon. Yes, you could say it's about family, absolutely. But I think at the core of Cancer is a sign about emotional connection. It's the first water sign. So you're learning how to connect to people in a very intimate and powerful, excuse me, and serious way. Saturn in Leo, you're learning powerful lessons and serious lessons about being yourself. Leo is such a creative sign. It's a sign of personality and persona, and you can't take that for granted. So you have to take yourself seriously. Saturn in Leo. Saturn in Virgo, you are learning lessons of accuracy. Virgo is a sign of perfection. It's a sign of organization, but ultimately Virgo is about getting things right. And so I think that Saturn and Virgo ultimately boils down to these lessons around accuracy. And of course, this will apply differently to the houses just based on where Saturn was when you were born. So Saturn in Libra, Libra, of course, is the sign of relationships, but I think it ultimately is teaching you these serious lessons around compromise. Libra is a sign of socialization. We have to understand that there are other people and other people have needs. And so with that comes compromise. Saturn and Scorpio, you're learning powerful, serious lessons around rebirth. Saturn, its time in Scorpio is not an easy time just because Scorpio deals with such heavy subject matter. Things that we don't want to talk about in polite company. I feel like Saturn went to Scorpio and it was all these major sex scandals came to the forefront. It was like almost like night and day. October 2012 was when Saturn went to Scorpio. So you're learning about these very deep, powerful, emotional lessons, but ultimately that teaches you about rebirth, about transformation and transforming yourself and transforming your life. Saturn in Sagittarius, I think this all boils down to lessons of truth. Yes, Saturn or Sagittarius is a sign of philosophy and religion and foreign travel, but what is your truth? And how do you wield that truth in the world? It's the karma of truth. Saturn in Capricorn is accountability, and Saturn is in Capricorn right now. It will be in Capricorn until next year, and I think ultimately we're learning very serious lessons around accountability. We can't get away with much, or the things that we are doing, we have to understand that they have an impact on the world and they have an impact on others. And so this is why I think that it's a time where we really have to hold ourselves up to a higher standard now that Saturn is in Capricorn. Saturn in Aquarius, I think it boils down to ultimately ideology. Aquarius is an air sign. It's ideas, but it's ideas that are made into form. Aquarius being the sign of consciousness. So I think that there's a lot of big ideas when Saturn is in Aquarius. And like, what's your ideology? What are you putting your, kind of your weight behind? Or are you caught up in some sort of ideology that's not helping you? Saturn in Pisces, I think, boils down to serious lessons in spirituality. Pisces being the last sign of the zodiac, and it is about this connection to, excuse me, this world that we can't see, the world of dreams, the world of energy, the world of spirituality and spirit. So you are learning these serious lessons around connection to something beyond this world. So Saturn lessons in the houses. So we'll kind of put this together in a few moments, but just to kind of go through things. So if you have Saturn in the first house, now it does have a little bit of a flavor of Saturn in Aries, but it is not Saturn in Aries. That's just the way that I look at astrology. But ultimately, when Saturn is in the first house, you have to step up and be the authority. You have to be Saturn. If Saturn's in your first house, anything that's in the first house, whether it's Mercury, whether it's Venus or whatever, you are becoming that planet. And I think that when Saturn is in the first house, maybe you've had very early lessons in maturity and taking on responsibility. I often have clients with Saturn the first where they had to grow up young. So that's kind of one of those Saturn in the first house lessons. Ultimately, I think that the higher octave of it is to learn to be a leader, learn to be the authority, learn to steer others in that very positive Saturn way. Saturn in the second house. Now, the second house is the house of resources and money and how we make our money. And if you have Saturn in the second house, you're having these lifelong lessons around money and what you value. So you might have this reoccurring story, and hopefully as we go through this, some of you are going like, oh yeah, ding, ding, ding. This is a ongoing theme in my life. And maybe sometimes it's in the background. We're not really giving it much conscious thought, but know that this is something that you keep returning to. So if you have Saturn in the second house, you're learning to master money and resource and the material world and material needs, the second house. So there might be times when you've struggled with money, when you've kind of struggled to be able to get the resources or get the material stability that you need. But it is through that struggle because, and I know that, Saturn at the end of the day is Saturn. Saturn's going to Saturn. It is a planet of struggle. So wherever Saturn is in your chart, you're going to have some struggle. That's part of the story arc. But with that resistance and with that struggle comes a mastery that you would not have. It's like if everything was always easy, we wouldn't learn anything. It's like we'd still be in kindergarten playing with paints and blocks, which doesn't sound too bad. I gotta be honest. But I think that there's bigger things that we came here to do and to learn. So that's, Saturn in the second house, for instance. Saturn in the third house. The third house is the house of the mind. It's the house of communication and information. It's where we are taking in the world and experience the world and having all these different experiences that teach us things. Saturn in the third has a lot to do with education and how you use your voice. I've also noticed that people who have Saturn in the third house, there's something around choice at the Saturn return. They had to make some sort of serious choice and really dealing with the karma of choices. So that's some kind of throwing that in there as Saturn in the third house. Saturn in the fourth house. Now, the fourth house, it's the house of family, it's the house of home, roots, memories. So you're learning to master this very primal part of life. It's your inner circle, your family. And then maybe we're talking about blood family, or maybe we're talking about people who are like family. But the kind of the story arc is always going to keep going back to learning to master this part of your life. And maybe you are maybe there's a theme around a matriarch or a patriarch in the family, and you're learning to step into that role. I think the fourth house also has a lot to do with the emotional core and let's say the root that your life is planted. And so I think also Saturn the fourth is about, what are your roots? Where are you planted? How are you getting what you need to thrive and to feel emotionally safe or materially safe in your life? So that's Saturn in the fourth. So Saturn in the fifth house. The fifth house is the house of the self, creativity, self-expression, talents, children. And so you're learning these very deep lessons in being yourself. There could be many reasons in your life, and maybe some of them go back to being quite young, as to why you wouldn't value yourself or want to express who you are or be yourself. And so really taking yourself seriously is gonna kind of come up again and again and again. I've seen Saturn in the fifth house of people who are really great artists or great writers, people that create things, but maybe they don't think their work is very good. They doubt themselves. And so there's this bigger story arc about how you're learning to really, Saturn can make us feel doubts. Saturn can sow fears. It's like we start to question everything with Saturn, but it's that we have to almost shake that version of Saturn off like a boogeyman and be like, okay, no, like my work is good enough. I could work harder. I could work, in a different way. But ultimately, you're learning the power and the importance of your talents, fifth house. And similarly, maybe children is also a major focus, because not everybody has children, so it might be that, it might be talents, but if you do have children, you might see that if you do have Saturn fifth house, that throughout your life there's been something about learning a lesson around children. I've also seen Saturn in the fifth house of people that work with children. They 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 work in a daycare, they work in an elementary school. Jenna asked about, does Saturn in the fifth impact fertility? I can't answer that because I feel like that question is like I need to go back and look at the data. But at the same time, I see Saturn by transit going through the fifth house when a woman gets pregnant. It's a very classic transit for pregnancy and birth, at least the birth of the first child. Saturn going through the fourth and Saturn going through the fifth. So to that point, Saturn doesn't affect fertility, but I also sometimes see when Capricorn or even Aquarius is on the fifth house cusp, that pregnancy can come later in life. That's just I don't know how empirical that answer is, but it's just what I've seen. So Saturn in the sixth house. So the sixth house is very much about real life. It's about how we show up in our day-to-day life. It's how we organize things, brushing our teeth, making sure we eat. I've sometimes seen people with Saturn in the sixth house, they forget to eat. They kind of forget to ground in the things that we need to do and to make sure that we as human beings are thriving and functioning. Sometimes Saturn in the sixth house, there's something around health. Don't want to make anybody nervous, but I think ultimately Saturn, you have to take the real world seriously. You have to take your health seriously. You have to take your schedule seriously. You have to be organized. And that's a lesson that you're going to keep coming back to over and over again. So Saturn in the seventh house is your mastering relationship. Now, in the old look at Saturn in the seventh house, like in the old text, they'll sometimes say that marriage is delayed or you don't get married. And I have not seen that. I mean, the seventh house is the house of marriage, but I also see the seventh house as the house where we learn to interface with other people. We learn to socialize and to compromise and to connect one-on-one. Yes, that also can mean our primary committed partnerships. So Saturn, I've seen people that have been married for 30 years with Saturn in the seventh. I've seen single people with Saturn in the seventh, but I think ultimately whatever your relationship status is, or whatever you want, it's important to master relationships. So this is not, let's say, a life where you get to be completely in the driver's seat, call the shots all the time. And that's something that we often do. This kind of comes up with clients. They're so used to being self-sufficient that there's no room for anybody else's input. So if you have Saturn in the seventh, you're learning to see what the other person wants. How can you bridge? How can you compromise? Which is partnership, it is relationship. Saturn in the eighth house. Now, I'm just being honest as a Scorpio, I think Saturn in the eighth house is a little tough because you're learning to master the shadow. What is the shadow? The shadow is the hidden side of life. The shadow is the things that we don't want to look at in ourselves and we don't want to look at in others. The eighth house is a place of intimacy, sexuality, facing our fears. It's the house of the psyche. The eighth house is also one of the money houses, so you might be looking at themes around money and debt and power and wealth as well. But there's definitely a deeper lesson around power and control. Who has power? Do you have power, or did somebody take power over you? But the eighth house can sometimes take us through some of the deepest experiences of life. But when you master that, you can master anything. You read about the eighth house and they call it the house of death, which, I mean, it's a lot more nuanced than that. But it's like, if you can master death, you can master anything. Mind you, nobody has full control over death, but you're able to be fearless, I think, ultimately, with Saturn in the eighth house. Nothing can phase you. Saturn in the ninth house. The ninth house is where we learn about the world. It's where we, encounter higher education, foreign travel. It's where we encounter religion. But ultimately, all those things are trying to shape how we see the world, what we believe in, what's our philosophy. So that's why I think that ultimately, with Saturn in the ninth, you're learning to master philosophy, and you may even be coming up with like this kind of way of seeing the world that's been very informed by all your experiences and all your travel. As somebody who has Saturn in the ninth, my personal experience with it is that there is a deeper lesson around, this word's a little loaded, but I'll flesh it out, morality. And that if we strip a lot of the political connotations of the word morality, this idea that there are things that you do and things that you don't do, that you kind of have this own, let's say, moral code that you live your life in. And hopefully you're living your life to a higher standard. You're actually trying to be a really good person. That's another way that I see Saturn the ninth. Sometimes you'll read traditionally that Saturn the ninth means that the father was very judgmental. I don't have that experience. I've seen that. I've had other astrologers look at my chart and tell me that, but maybe I'm just putting that out there in case you do have Saturn in the ninth, and that's you've dealt with fundamentalism, or you were raised in a very fundamentalist household, and you need to have a new, completely new way of seeing the world that's different than how you were raised. Saturn in the ninth. Saturn in the 10th, you are learning to master ambitions. What does that mean? The 10th house is the highest house in the chart. It's the house of career, reputation, goals, ambitions. And when Saturn is in the 10th, you have to constantly, like say, push yourself higher and higher to achieve. I've sometimes read some things, I don't know if I've actually seen this with clients, but I'm just kind of putting it out there that Saturn the 10th can bring, like, it just takes longer to find your place in the world, maybe. But I think ultimately, I mean, I have Saturn in whole sign 10th, and I think that I'm a little bit of a workaholic, I'm not gonna lie, but I think ultimately there's big goals. I think you're trying to achieve something when Saturn's in the 10th, but at the same time, because Saturn is so visible, the 10th house is the most visible house in the chart, you don't do bad things, because I think sometimes when Saturn's in the 10th, if you're I'm not saying any of you are, but Saturn in the 10th can bring out, let's say, a fall from grace if you are not kind of living up to that higher standard of Saturn. Saturn in the 11th house. The 11th house is where we encounter community and friendships and social circles. It's the house of humanity. And so I think ultimately with Saturn in the 11th, you're going to keep returning to these stories around who's your tribe? Who are your people? Who are your friends? Do you belong, or do you feel like you're an outsider? And I do see this in a lot of my client work with people who have Saturn in the 11th. There is that thread of being an outsider. There's that sense of, looking, nose pressed against the glass, looking in through, into some place where there's people and just wanting to be there, but you can't, you feel separate. But I think ultimately you're trying to find your people. And Saturn in the 11th house, you have to have really strong friendships. You can't have these very surface level friendships with Saturn in the 11th. These have to be rock solid connections. And that's true for wherever Saturn is. Saturn ultimately is building over time something that is rock solid. I made that kind of offhand remark earlier that Saturn is like the stuff that shows up in your obituary, it's because these are the things that stand the test of time. It's what kind of got etched into the stone of your life. Saturn. The 12th house. So Saturn, I don't think is the happiest in the 12th house, if I'm being a little honest, because Saturn is about the material world. It's about matter and manifestation. And the 12th house is anything but. The 12th house is the space between lives. It's the space between this world and the next world. We go to the 12th house to prepare to be reborn in the first. So the 12th house, it's a very existential placement for Saturn. It's, what does this all mean? It could be somebody that is very deep into study or themes around spirituality. Maybe they're looking, always searching for deeper answers. Or it's somebody that really does struggle with their place in the world. Sometimes Saturn, the 12th house is a place that's very removed from the world. So sometimes we feel very separate, but you're learning to master the 12th. And ultimately, that means you're learning to master something that's not manifested in this real world. It's very subjective. It's dreams, it's mysticism, it's meditation, it's retreat. And being at peace. I think there's mastering the soul with Saturn in the 12th house. So when we put this together, we are experiencing the lesson of the sign in the house. So I'll give you an example, and this is an example from my life, and maybe this will kind of give you a sense of how to put it together in your own chart. So I have Saturn in Virgo, so I'm learning these deep lessons, these serious lessons around accuracy, around diligence, being organized, service. These are all kind of these Virgo words. And because I have Saturn in the 9th by what's called Placidus or whole sign 10th, that energy is being applied to the 9th house. I have to be diligent, and I have to be accurate, and I have to be organized, and 9th house matters. Now, when I had my Saturn return, I came to astrology, and I, not too long after, I was like, I want to be an astrologer. Now, here I am, 11 years later, kind of time flies, and I am an astrologer. And I'm having this webinar with you all, and I'm hopefully being very good about my words and what I'm communicating. And I have a philosophy about astrology, and I have a philosophy about life, 9th house, and I have to be diligent about it, and I have to be accurate about it, and I have to keep pushing myself to these levels of perfection. But, I think with every sign, we have to make sure that we don't get caught in the shadow of that sign. So the shadow of Virgo, for instance, is it's never good enough. So that can sometimes be, let's say, my personal demon. It's never good enough, Virgo. So sometimes I have to come tell myself it is good enough, because Saturn and Virgo level of good is way beyond a lot of other levels of good. So hopefully that makes sense of how you're starting to put this together. So just to recap, look at your Saturn sign. Hopefully you've looked it up, you know it, or you knew it already before this call. Really work with the keywords of the sign. And then that is taking place in the house. So in astrology, the house is where something takes place. The sign is how that part of your life gets colored. Saturn in, let's say, Scorpio, in the 10th house, if you're learning to master the shadow, and then you're having Saturn is in the 10th house, that's happening in your professional life. Maybe you are a therapist. Maybe you're working with the threshold, this idea of life and death, bringing life in, working as a midwife, bringing life out, working as somebody in hospice. Rochelle says Saturn in Aries in her first house. So Saturn in Aries is learning to have courage and bravery and to take action. And then and Saturn's actually in the house, or the first house is kind of normally the domain of Aries anyway. So that is, you're learning to be a leader, be an authority in your life. Saturn in the fourth house in Libra, and you guys are typing very fast. So Saturn in Libra is about, what did we say? It was compromise, or consensus, or yeah. Then you're learning that sense of compromise and consensus and peace and balance, Libra, in the fourth house, home, family, roots. Maybe home and family is a perfectly fine place. She says you have a challenging life with family. So it's like, how do you find peace and balance in that part of your life? That's a lesson that you'll keep returning to. And the whole premise of this webinar, in addition to, let's say, facing Saturn at certain times of your life, is that if you know that Saturn is asking you to find peace in this part of your life, then you can work with that in consciousness a lot differently than if you're like in defensive mode, if it keeps happening to you. It's, sometimes with Saturn in the fourth house, you may have to make your own family. You might have to strike out on your own and put down your own roots. Saturn and Pisces in the 12th. So Saturn is in its home. It's kind of like it's like the same lesson. You don't have to, like, how do I put this? It's double spirituality. You guys are typing really quickly. Okay. Let me get back to where the question was. Yes, Saturn Pisces is in the 12th. So Pisces rules the 12th. Pisces normally rules the 12th. So it's a little bit more clear cut, Kim. You're mastering spirituality. You're mastering the soul. You're learning lessons, these deeper existential questions around what it means to be here in this world, and to participate in this world. But ultimately, your life is going to keep coming back to spirituality. So that's going to be a thread that keeps running through. Linda is saying, there we go, Saturn and Capricorn, the second return. Yeah, if you are going through your second Saturn return, do go back and reflect on what was going on with your first Saturn return, because now you're kind of returning to a lot of the situations, thematically, the situations, sometimes literally the situations that were going on 29 years ago. So Linda, do reflect in your own time what it was to step into authority in your life. When you look up your chart and find out what house it's in, like, where are you being an authority in that part of your life? So you'll just need to look up and see where your Saturn is by house. Hang on, okay. Joe asked Saturn Aquarius in the 9th. So Aquarius, again, is kind of it's like an ideology. And the 9th house is the place of belief and learning philosophy. So it's a very intellectual lessons that you might keep coming to. It might be education, Joe. But maybe you're here to teach and to teach people your ideology. Just be very careful about what it is. When Saturn is kind of in the energy of Sagittarius, the 9th house, I think that it's really important to have flexibility and to be okay with being wrong, because it's just, there's this shadow side of Saturn in Sagittarius, or Saturn in the 9th, where it's fundamentalism, where your truth is the only truth. So just if you're learning to kind of build up your own ideology and to teach, Joe, it's just very open. I'm sure it is, but I'm just kind of doing my due diligence as an astrologer. Saturn Aquarius in the 7th. So yeah, if second Saturn return relationships. So yeah, that's going to be next year. It's going to be the year after. So you're learning lessons around partnership and connection and really reflecting on what that means in your life, because now is, going into next year is going to be your big check-in on relationships and how you compromise and socialize with people. Saturn in Aquarius, see what sort of beliefs you have around relationships. Sometimes Saturn, and there's a little bit of the Saturn in 11th energy. If you feel if there's any problems with connecting, it's like one of those things where like I don't have the full chart, so there might be more nuance to this. Gemma asks, mention Placidus in whole signs. If Placidus is in one house, if Saturn is in one house in Placidus and another in whole signs, do both house energies apply to the person? Does the person have to master both houses? Okay, so slightly unpopular answer. Yeah, I think yes-ish. So I'm one of those people. In Placidus, I have Saturn in the 9th, and then in whole sign, I have Saturn in the 10th. And I gotta tell you, I see them both. So I have to master the 10th house, career, reputation, building something, success, all that kind of 10th house stuff. But I also have Saturn the 9th. And so there's a sense of education and philosophy. Guess what, guys? I'm trying to educate you. Hopefully, I'm doing my Saturn in the 9th house. For me, like the vehicle for all this is astrology. So that's how, for me personally, it's applying to the 9th house and both the 10th. Bridget asked Saturn, Aries in the 5th. Again, Saturn in Aries is about having courage and bravery. And you're learning to have fifth house, put that courage and bravery into the 5th house. So what is the 5th house? The 5th house is the house of the self. It's the house of talents. You're having courage to be yourself and to honor and to take seriously your talents. Next question just says, I don't have my glasses on, just says, Saturn and Capricorn in the 5th house, where Saturn turned age 29. So Saturn and Capricorn, yes. I think Saturn in general in Capricorn wants big things in the world, big, success, big ambitions. The thing about you all with Saturn and Capricorn right now, age 28, 29, and even age 30, you're part of this micro generation. I call it the Berlin Wall generation. So kids going through people going through their Saturn return right now, were born in 80, 88, 89, and 1990. And those 3 years, Saturn was in the sky with Uranus and Neptune. They were forming what's called a triple conjunction. And I feel like you guys, yes, you have big ambitions and you want to have a big impact on the world, Saturn and Capricorn, but you're doing it with Uranus and Neptune. And this is why I think that your generation, you're never going to be the people sitting in the cubicle or doing it the way that your parents did it. You have to invent something completely new. And you might have to, be radical about it, Uranus. You might have to tear down walls. So this idea that anything is possible, in fact, the internet was born, the internet as we know it, not the internet as a military thing, was born in, I think it was 1989, maybe 1990. Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web. So maybe that can kind of give you a little bit of nuance to some of the things that you're going through. Just scrolling through, thank you everybody for your kind feedback. And hopefully Saturn thinks so as well. I did this webinar, and I'm a big fan of, I like Saturn because I just feel like it does what it says on the box. Like it's a really black and white planet. And I'm just like, okay, like there's no ambiguity with Saturn. Like if we were having a conversation about Neptune or, Uranus or some of the other planets where you can kind of get into these different shades. It's with Saturn, there are no shades. It's like this or that or nothing. You do it. And so this is why I'm like, for me personally, I'm like, okay, I have Saturn in the 9th. I have Saturn in Virgo. Like that's what I keep coming back to. So okay, Saturn, I get it. I'm going to keep, just going to keep working. I'm going to keep pushing. I'm going to keep teaching and organizing and being of service and kind of being out there in the world. Susan asked, Saturn whole first and Placidus 12th. Oh yes, Saturn and Libra. So Susan, you'll have a little bit of that, both those experiences. The thing about when a planet is in the 12th and Placidus, and I say this as somebody who has 3 planets in the 12th, and I know that in whole sign, those planets go into the first. But I feel like with a planet in the 12th, it's still got that hidden quality or that shy quality if it's in the 12th. So that said, Susan, see how you resonate with this idea of being the peacemaker or somebody who is really working on these lessons of connection and socialization, Libra, and doing it in the first house, being the authority, but also in the 12th, finding peace with source, creator, God, spirituality, whatever you want to call it, that very deep existential nature of Saturn in the 12th. Just reading another comment. Sorry, I have to process all this. Anne says, great info on Saturn. However, this year I have Cancer rising. Saturn is opposite in Capricorn. Okay, so Saturn is in the 7th. More challenges, right? Cancer at Saturn. Oh, if I'm understanding your question correctly, Anne, do you mean Saturn opposite Saturn? Let me know if I'm if I'm understanding correctly. If you have, I mean, I don't know if this is what you're asking, but if you have Saturn in the first, and then Saturn is now in the sign opposite, that you're having what's called a Saturn opposition. So it's, if you're age 43, 67, Cancer rising at first. I'm having a moment where it's like I need to see it. Like I have a hard time like answering the question without kind of seeing it. Cancer rising. Oh, so I think also I would add that if Saturn is in what's called a cardinal house, so the 7th, the 10th, the 1st, or the 4th, it's going to have a different quality than Saturn in the other houses by transit. So I think when Saturn goes through the 7th by transit, you're working on relationships. So whether you are in a serious committed partnership or you're not, or maybe your connection with other people could use some work. Saturn is really working on you to connect with people and to have relationship. You're also, we do have the eclipses right now in Saturn or in Capricorn and Cancer. So you're getting, it's a big time for you in general. And Jupiter affects Saturn if it's on. So this kind of brings me, Linda, to I think another. So Saturn in aspect, I'm purposely not talking about Saturn aspects because this would become a 4-hour webinar, and I'm sure everybody wants to like go have lives and do other things and talk about Saturn. But Saturn in aspect, I mean, because, you might have Saturn strongly in your chart. Maybe it's making an opposition or a square. That's going to really work that planet. That planet needs to kind of find its legs. It needs to grow. It needs to mature. It needs to face its fears and doubts. So if you have Saturn in aspect, I like I said, from personal experience, Saturn square a Sagittarius stellium. So I've learned to appreciate Saturn, but I had a lot of fears and doubts as a child. I'll just quickly go through this because I know we're kind of getting to the end of things. I just wanted to get people to take consciousness that Saturn is in astrology, or Saturn is in Capricorn. It's been in Capricorn since the very end of 2017. It will, Saturn is at home right now, so collectively we are all doing work on Capricorn. So accountability, structure, power. And so when Saturn is in a sign, we're kind of facing the karma of that sign. So we're all facing personally and collectively our karma with power, whether it's the abuse of power or unequal power structures. So remember, Saturn loves balance. Saturn is exalted in Libra. So this is a time where we have to bring power structures back into balance, because ultimately Saturn likes balance. Next year in January, Saturn will join up with Pluto. This is a once in a 40-year alignment, so it's a pretty big deal. So all this Saturn energy, and then it meets Pluto, the planet of the shadow. So we're doing a lot of deep shadow work on power and control. But we're also really blasting through structure. And this is structure in our lives. This could be physical structure, emotional structure, and spiritual structure. Again, Saturn is limits and boundaries, but sometimes we've created or imprisoned ourselves with limits and boundaries. So how do you bust through them? And that's another topic for another time. And so Saturn will leave Capricorn from March until July. So we'll have a little preview of Saturn in Aquarius, and then it gets back into Capricorn next July, and then it's into Aquarius in December. So the narrative will shift. The great clock hand will start to point towards a different sign, and all collectively we'll have to start to do a lot of work on the sign of Aquarius. Aquarius is humanity. It's the collective. It's politics. It's community. It's friendships. It's also hopes and dreams for the future. So that's going to be a big theme in 2020, but more like 2021, 2022. So now is your time to ask questions if you have them. While we're here, it is getting a little, I'll take a couple of questions, but also if you think of a question after we have ended, please send me an email. That's what I'm here for. I want to teach you all to love, but also respect Saturn, because Saturn can be a life coach. And as a life coach, it's trying to push us all to be our best selves. And no pain, no gain. I know we're all tired, and I wish my Saturn was in the sign of beach with pina colada transiting, but that's not the life I apparently signed up for. I signed up for a combination of Saturn in the 9th and Saturn in the 10th. I'm a double major. I was a double major in college and university, and I guess I'm an overachiever. But it's been a story. It's been a process. It's been a story arc of learning to grow into my Saturn. And so I hope that each and every one of you grow into your Saturn. Doesn't matter if you're 25 or 65. So there is a lesson that you came here to learn and to master. And that's like your curriculum. So where Saturn is by sign and where Saturn is by house, that's going to give you a lot of material to work with. And then each 3 years, Saturn moves to a different sign, and collectively we work on that sign. But how does that relate back to our original lesson, or lessons, plural? And Saturn is about mastery, but it's also about building. Saturn is the builder, and at the end of our lives, we're going to want to look back and say, I built something, whether it's physical or emotional or spiritual, but we built something. And so we have to really be accountable. We have to face ourselves. We have to face Saturn. Tomorrow we face Saturn when Saturn turns direct. Hopefully this is the moment where you are like, okay, I can do this. I know you can do this. Hey, I've got Mars square Saturn and Saturn square Mercury. And if I can do it, you can do it. But yeah, there's going to be times when you doubt yourself, you doubt your faith in yourself. But like I said, Saturn, I love Saturn because it's so black and white. It's telling you exactly what you need to do. So again, if there's any more questions, otherwise we will end it here. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, thank you, Susan. Thank you, Rochelle. Thank you, Joe. I know a lot of you consistently sign up for my webinars. I mean, it's about like 85% repeats. So thank you. It means I'm doing my job well, and I get to share astrology with you all and to teach astrology and to give you all a new perspective on astrology, because I think astrology is this really powerful tool that helps us to understand ourselves better, be better partners, be better human beings in this world, so that we can grow up and grow older. I'm just looking at some other comments. Yes, so I'm just reading Saturn. There's some personal stories with Saturn in the seventh, but maybe finally get married or make that connection. But I think it's kind of like wherever Saturn, like where the North Node is. Like if we just keep moving towards that sign, if we keep moving towards our Saturn in whatever sign it is and whatever house it is, and like doing the serious study, and in a way you're getting your PhD in that part of your chart. So they don't just give those things away. You have to study, you have to do the tests, you have to write your dissertation, and you have to defend your dissertation. So there's going to be, that's a part of your life that you're really saying, look, I learned a lot of stuff in this lifetime. So anyway, yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Bridget. Thank you, everybody that joined on the live call. And thank you to those that are watching the replay. Again, always a pleasure. My name is Katie Sweetman. I'm Empowering Astrology. You can follow me on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter. Please sign up for my newsletter so you can stay in the loop about future webinars, future events, other pertinent things. So again, thank you all so much. Until the next time. Bye.